Greetings and welcome back to 303 in Junior English. We turn now in your hymnals to page 1056, 1057 and following. We're going to now turn to the great American poet Theodore Roethke and two of his poems, Cuttings and then Cuttings Later. We'll start with some biography information on 1057. Let's go there. Note your dates, 1908 to 1963. Let's read together, learn a little bit here, okay? Theodore Roethke was born and raised in Saginaw, Michigan, where his family owned several large commercial greenhouses. As a boy, Roethke was a passionate observer of the plants that grew in the greenhouse. He observed nature putting forth roots and blossoms as well as falling into dormancy and death. These observations later provided him with ideas and inspirations for many of his poems. In 1923, Roethke's father lost his battle with cancer, an event that also heavily influenced Roethke's poetry. First major heading, Refuge in Writing. Throughout his life, Roethke found it difficult to relate to other people. Poetry and nature gave him a refuge in which to explore various aspects of his own life. Although his style changed throughout his career, the impulse to explore the meaning of subjective personal experience remained a constant. Next heading, First Successes. After receiving his education at the University of Michigan and Harvard, Roethke taught writing at Bennington College, Pennsylvania State University, and the University of Washington. A slow, diligent writer, he spent many years assembling poems for his first book. At age 33, he published his first volume, Open House, 1941, launching a career as one of the most acclaimed poets of his day. He won the Pulitzer Prize for The Waking, 1953, and the National Book Award for The Far Field in 1964, which was published after his death. From short, witty poems to complex philosophical free verse, Roethke's poetry reflects a wide range of feelings and poetic styles. Roethke published several more books, including The Lost Son, 1948, and Words for the Wind, 1958. Last heading, A Lasting Influence. Theodore Roethke's work was an inspiration both to his contemporaries and to writers today. Remarking on his place in American literature, renowned poet Stanley Kuntz said Roethke was, quote, in possession of a dynasty of extraordinary gifts and powers, end quote. Let's turn now to 2B and rhetorical concerns and literary analysis information on 1056. Let's make sure we have these words written down at 2B really quickly. Roethke's poignant imagist poetry achieved some of its emotional effect and beauty through sound devices. Let's write this down. Sound devices. We'll look at three of them. First is alliteration. There it is on 1056. Make sure you've got that word in your notes at 2B. Alliteration, repetition of a consonant sound at the beginnings of words. Notice the example, what saint strained so much, rose on such lopped limbs to a new life. Repetition of both S and L sounds. Assonance is the repetition of a vowel sound in stressed syllables with dissimilar consonant sounds. For example, I quell, lean to beginnings, sheath wet, the repetition of the E sound. Finally, consonance is the repetition of consonant sounds and stressed syllables in the middle or at the end of words. For example, the small cells bulge. You can see the repetition of the L sounds, right? In Cuttings and Cuttings Later, Roethke ponders the microscopic movements of a plant, movements so small in scale that their sounds are undetectable by the human ear. Through his use of sound devices, the poet gives these tiny movements a music all their own and invites the reader to move in close to hear the delicate strings. The reading strategy here is using background knowledge about nature and its process to help you understand the nuances of the poem. In some ways, I have often said that studying these two poems is kind of what happens when the English department meets the biology or the science department. You'll see what I mean here in a second when we take a look at these two poems. By the way, pay attention to the three vocab words on 1056 as well. All right, let's turn to 1059. If you'll turn to 1059 and then flip the page over to 1060, you'll see here that we're working with two poems that are very closely related to each other. Okay? Because they are so closely related to each other, I will do them both together in a single lecture. So let's take a look, first of all, at background information at the top of 1059. When Theodore Roethke's grandparents immigrated to the United States in 1872, they settled in Saginaw, Michigan, where they earned a living by growing and selling plants. Roethke's father and uncle inherited this trade and would go on to own one of the largest greenhouses in the state. As a child, Roethke spent countless hours in this greenhouse, gaining an informal but extensive education in the art and science of gardening. One of the many gardening strategies he learned was how to grow a new plant from a cutting. Now this you're one in your notes. This is important information. This is prior knowledge. You need to read these poems. A cutting, also known as a slip, is a twig, branch, or leaf cut from a mature plant and placed in water or wet sand. Water moves upward through the cutting from its base by a process called diffusion. You want to write that down. Diffusion, the way water moves up the plant. Diffusion occurs when water molecules move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration by passing through the walls of cells. As more and more water enters the cells of the cutting, water pressure builds, which in turn causes the cutting to stand upright. By the way, you can Google this at YouTube and you can see this is really neat if you haven't seen it before in a biology class. Water pressure also stimulates cell growth, and soon, under the proper conditions, the cutting will sprout new roots and leaves. When the roots are strong enough, the cutting, now a plant, can be potted in soil. Okay. Now, what we're going to see in cuttings is a speaker who takes a close look at the cellular changes that cause a plant cutting to sprout. The view suggests a small cycle of death and renewal. Right? In Cuttings Later, the second poem we'll look at, the speaker comments on the plant's continuing struggle to grow roots and thrive. He imagines the tiny sucking and sobbing sounds produced by the straining sprouts. Now, of course, we should point out, and let's write it right now down at 2b. These are both poems that are going to very much involve us in the use of metaphor. In other words, something resembles something else. Metaphor. So in other words, let's just point it out already at level 1. This is not just two dumb poems about how you can grow stuff from cutting something off of a living plant. Although obviously there will be that involved as well. All right, let's listen now to the poems. We'll begin with Cuttings on 1059 and then Cuttings Later on 1060. Let's listen to both of them. And then we'll come back to do some work with both of them, all right? So follow along. Here we go. Cuttings.
Cuttings by Theodore Roethke. Sticks in a drowse droop over sugary loam. Their intricate stem fur dries. But still the delicate slips keep coaxing up water. The small cells bulge. One nub of growth nudges a sand crumb loose. Pokes through a musty sheath, its pale, tendrilless horn. Cuttings by Theodore Roethke.
1060.
Later. This urge, resurrection of dry sticks, cut stems struggling to put down feet. What saint strained so much, rose on such lopped limbs to a new life? I can hear underground that sucking and sobbing in my veins, in my bones I feel it. The small waters seeping upward, the tight grains parting at last. When sprouts break out, slippery as fish, I quail, lean to beginnings, sheath wet.
Now, for those of you who come out of any background where you listen to the music that today is popularly known as rap music, you will already begin to appreciate that what Roethke is doing is playing with the language and sound. And in many ways, he is simulating through the language the sound that he imagines happens when new life, new growth happens. So we're going to marvel in some ways at nothing more than at 2b, the sounds of these two poems, which is again why you have all of these examples that we were pointing out to you on page 1056. Alliteration, what saint strained so much, rose on such lopped limbs to a new life. Assonance, I quell, lean to beginnings, sheath wet, the final lines from Cuttings Later. Consonants, the small cells bulge. You can see the repetition of L sounds. Let's go ahead and stay at level 2B for these two poems really quickly. We'll reference them as cuttings and cuttings later. You can appreciate that cuttings is the beginning, cuttings later will begin to address some of the actual light growth that's happening. We'll think of these though together, and let's begin at 2B. Let's look at the form of these two poems. Let's start at 1059 with cuttings. Notice that this is a poem that will have identifiably two stanzas. Do you see it? So we've got 4 lines in the first stanza. We've got 4 lines in the second stanza. When we look at cuttings later, notice we've got an interesting kind of formation of organization as well. 4 lines for the first stanza. Notice then you have lines 5 through 9 as your lines, 5 lines of the second stanza, and then a single final 2 lines of a stanza. In regards to rhythms, you can play games, but still the delicate slips keep coaxing up water. You can take a look at line 3, for example, of cuttings and see that one. The small cells bulge, 1 nub of growth. You've got certain kinds of meter and rhythm as well being played here by Roethke. He is in full possession of poetic genius, we might say. Let's go ahead, though, and play the game of sound for just a moment. Listen to all the different sounds we're playing with as we look at cuttings. Sticks in a drouse droop over sugary loam. Their intricate stem fur dries, but still the delicate slips keep coaxing up water. The small cells bulge. Put it at level 1. What did you just read? Quite literally, what did you just read? Well, your prior knowledge, of course, above helps you to know that what we're talking about here is the process of how you can derive new growth from cutting or lopping off from another life form, right? So you take a piece of a plant from a living plant, you cut it off. Question, when you cut it off, is it living or dead? Now that's a very interesting question, because if you say, well, when you cut it off it's living, the obvious answer is, no. The minute you sever something living from the plant, then immediately it has to start to die. In other words, let's say it out loud, if you cut it off, it's dead. But it's not quite dead. Resurrection. It has the ability, notice the second stanza, 1 nub of growth, nudges a sand crumb loose, pokes through a musty sheath its pale, tenderless horn. In other words, you can start to actually witness. And like I said, if you go to YouTube and you type in that you want to see this, they do this thing with fast cameras, if you've ever seen this before on movies, where they can show it to you over a period of time, and it is miraculous. It is truly miraculous to watch this growth grow right out of wet sand or out of water, and the roots that start to grow. All right, that's level 1 of cuttings. Let's now work at level 2A. Can you see any kind of possible messages or themes in this first poem called Cuttings? Let's start with the title. The word cuttings doesn't probably make much sense to you until your prior knowledge reading, and then of course the poem itself. And you begin to realize we're talking about taking away something so that it can grow later. Let's mention again that notion of the phoenix. You will maybe remember in our study of Eudora Welty's Worn Path that Phoenix Jackson is the name of our heroine, and the phoenix mythology is something grows until it dies, and then out of its ashes, new life resurrected, new life born. Jot down in your notes, how does that game get played in this poem, Cuttings? Where you're going to take something, you're going to cut it off of something alive, and you're going to plant it, you're going to work with it in some way, and then new life will come, regenerative. The word regenerate is an important word for us in terms of a message or a theme, so let's write that down. Life is always about the regenerative process. Of course, we could jump really quickly to 3A and make the observation. Don't you remember, this is exactly what Walt Whitman said in his famous passage 6 from Song of Myself, A child came to me and brought to me grass and asked me, the poem says, what is this? And the poet speaker Whitman says, how could I answer the child any better than he? And then he starts to think about what grass is. Perhaps it is, at the very end of that passage 6, he even makes the observation that dying is something quite different, because what happens when you're dead? You're planted in the ground. What comes out of the ground? The grass grows out of the ground. Somehow an extension of the very body that's been planted in the ground. Let's jump to 2b for just a second and point out all of the different sounds that are involved here. The small cells bulge, for example, as consonants as an example. You're going to see some of these examples, by the way, mentioned on the exam, which is why I'm pointing it out to you. Finally, let's go to level 3 in the ways that we want to relate this title to other texts first at 3a. What is for you your favorite text that you are familiar with about growing and maturing? Do you have a favorite novel that talks about growing and maturing? I'm going to pause here and just have you jot down the great Charles Dickens, because Dickens loves novels that show growth. And right at the moment in many of his novels that you think that something really terrible is going to happen and the young person is going to probably not make it, he finds a way to make it. We think of Oliver Twist. We think of Great Expectations. 2 classic novels. Of course, David Copperfield comes to mind. All of these novels share in common the very idea that Roethke is playing with here, that right about the moment you think you're dead and gone, resurrection can happen. What is your favorite movie where you think it's going to end really badly and then it ends really well? Can you write down a title that comes to mind in that regards? Finally, let's finish with 3b. How do you relate personally to a poem like this? It's just a silly 8-line poem about how you can cut something off of something living and it will grow. But it does beg some interesting questions about you personally. Like, for example, this one. When you look, I'll start with 3a. When you look, for example, at Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, and I certainly recommend it to you, it's such a classic text. One of the first things that he says is, I want to begin by thanking all of the people who made me who I am. You'll maybe, when you're a senior, hopefully remember that I'm making the comment that I'm making right now. When we meet Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem Ulysses, there's a line there that says, I am part of all that I have met. In other words, you are a product of all of these amazing people in your life. Marcus Aurelius starts listing those people. From my uncle, I want to say thank you for this. From my mother, I want to say thank you for this. Now the question, the 3b question. If you are a product of a plant that has somehow been connected to a life form of another plant, who is most influential in your life as that primary plant? Who is most responsible for your growing and your maturing? Do you have someone you can write down that you would say is most responsible for your growing and your maturing? And of course, the follow-up question will be, have you told that someone thank you? Have you told that someone how important his or her life has been in your life? It's somewhat sad that I had a student who said, you know, the tragedy is I now can see that I am hugely influenced, if you will, to continue the metaphor. The primary life growth was my grandpa. And I can see the ways in which his life heavily influenced my own. And in fact, my maturing process in large measure was because of him. I'm kind of an offshoot, if you will, to continue the word picture, the metaphor. I'm kind of an offshoot of him. But the tragedy is, he died a couple of years ago, and now I don't have any way to say thank you to him. I was too young at the point when he passed to realize how influential he was in my life. Let's now come back to the second poem, a 1060, Cuttings Later. And let's take a look now at this one. We're further along down the line. This urge, wrestle, and then there's the word. Resurrection of dry sticks. Cut stems, struggling to put down feet. What saint strained so much, rose on such lopped limbs to a new life? Let's pause at level 1. He asks a very interesting question. Literally, the question is, how much work is it to go from being dead you're cut off, to being alive. At 2a, let's go ahead and jump to it quickly. The point here, the message is, resurrection is hard work. Renaissance, rebirth, is hard work, both for a culture as well as for a person. Of course, at 3b, we could ask this question about you personally. Do you feel as a junior you're starting to go through certain kinds of resurrection, certain kinds of growth, certain kinds of dynamic finding the dry sticks of your life being resurrected, finding a way to put down your feet, finding a way to make it? The question that Roethke, the speaker, asks is, saints, people who have to find spiritual maturity, never strained any more than this young bit of growth that's finding its way. The second stanza, back to level 1, the second stanza is very interested in the sounds of growing. I can hear underground that sucking and sobbing in my veins, in my bones. I feel it. Notice the dash. The small waters seeping upward, the tight grains parting at last when sprouts break out. Let's just pause for a moment and pay attention to the ways in which life is about sounds, compelling sounds. Notice the sucking and sobbing sounds. Let's jump really quickly to 2a. Again, we'll come back to the question, what are the sounds of growth that we are talking about? Let's make the observation that a message theme here can easily be identified as, with growth must come pain. With growth must come fear. Of course, at 3a, we can make this